On this episode of Comics to Movies, we will look at the 1938 film The Lone Ranger. This is the first of many films starring the Lone Ranger and Tonto, and this is the first origin story we'll cover in this show. The film stars Lee Powell as the Lone Ranger and Chief Thundercloud as Tonto. It is directed by William Whitney and John English. The initial release of the film was serialized and broken into 15 parts, running just under 4.5 hours. However, a couple years later, the studio released a feature film version that was only about an hour and 20 minutes. To save time, I watched the shorter version.
Whatever you say.
You can check them both out on YouTube, and I'll leave the link in the description below. The Lone Ranger serial follows the Lone Ranger on his first adventure against a gang of criminals led by Captain Mark Smith. He gets a man in his gang to trick a group of Texas Rangers into falling into a trap. The Texas Rangers are all killed and the traitor was shot. The only Ranger who survived would turn into the Lone Ranger. He crawls to a body of water to try and nurse himself back to health when Tonto ends up finding him. As it turns out, the Lone Ranger once helped Tonto long ago, causing Tonto to want to join the Lone Ranger in his quest to avenge the Texas Rangers. Meanwhile, the traitor who was shot was not killed and attempts to kill Tonto and the Lone Ranger, but falls off a mountain and dies in the process. This led to a very awesome dummy death. Tonto and the Ranger move on and quickly find an injured horse about to be mauled to death by a buffalo. The Ranger kills the buffalo and then asks the horse to join him on his quest. They instantly become best friends. Soon the two run into a man named Sam and save him. He shows them a silver mine, and the Lone Ranger decided from then on out he will only shoot silver bullets, and it'll leave a message to criminals that it was the Lone Ranger and make him more of a symbol. At this point, the Lone Ranger decides to enlist the help of law enforcement, who quickly gain trust for the Lone Ranger. They ride out and quickly capture the gang leader. However, when the Lone Ranger rides off, the rest of the gang shows up and captures the sheriff and frees the gang leader. The Lone Ranger then goes back into action and tracks down the gang, and the gang and law enforcement get into a big battle. Meanwhile, the Lone Ranger tracks down the leader and quickly defeats him. Once the gang is all captured, the Lone Ranger decides that he'll become the Lone Ranger permanently and continue to avenge people and fight crime. Honestly, this was a good film. It was a compelling origin to the character, which was the backbone to this version, and properly established the Lone Ranger in a way that keeps the audience interesting and made you really want justice for the Texas Rangers and the Lone Ranger. One thing that this movie could have done without, however, was the narrator.
Then, by chance, the native spies the figure lying beside the distant pool. He moves forward.
He really only appeared for the first half of this film, but he really didn't have much of a purpose except establishing things we can see happening on screen and to push flashbacks that I'm assuming were in the original edit of the serial. The film features many stunts that are actually kind of impressive, between the Lone Ranger climbing dangerous hills and the horse work, as well as some decent action scenes for the time. The acting in this movie is pretty standard for the time. I thought Chief Thundercloud did a good job as Tonto, and Lee Powell did okay as the Lone Ranger, but he sounded horribly out of breath for the entire film.
One of them, Captain Reed, was my brother.
That may just have been his voice, or perhaps the condition they were filming in, but it's hard to say. Compared to The Shadow Strikes, this film does not have the most impressive shot composition and editing, but part of that probably comes down to the speed this film was produced. Filming the full 4.5 hour long edit of this film was done in a measly 19 days, with stunts, dealing with animals and all. Overall, this was a good film and a great example of not only serial film telling, but also Western storytelling and the precursor to the modern superhero film. And true to the nature of the show, I must point out things I've noticed in this film that many superheroes would adopt down the line. Of course, the Lone Ranger has a hidden identity that is now a key part of virtually every superhero, but he also refuses to kill, as he wants to see criminals pay in the court of law because he's above the criminals and their practices. Pretty interesting stuff to compare, especially to modern heroes like Batman, who have very similar rules against killing and has his own secret identity. This film follows the basic plot of the original radio show pretty much exactly, with a few small changes. In both series, the Ranger is part of a company of 6 Rangers that are tricked into an ambush and attacked. Originally, the gang leader who perpetrated the attack was named Butch Cavendish. In the film, however, his name was changed to Captain Mark Smith. In the full extended serial edition, there is a subplot where it is revealed that Alan King is the Lone Ranger. In the radio version, he has never had a full name revealed. However, we do know the last name is Reed. It is said that behind the scenes, Adaptions, the creator of the Lone Ranger, George W. Trendle, did not like this change, as the idea for the character was that his identity is supposed to be secret to the characters he's interacting with, as well as the audience. Other than that, the basic origin is still intact. He creates a mask out of his brother's vest, he saves Tonto, and the basic story structure of the original is still intact. All in all, this film was good, both as an adaptation and as a film. If you're into old westerns or the 50s show, definitely give this a watch. I cannot suggest the full serial, however, because I've only watched the shorter version, but the shorter version has a full story that works very well and accurately follows the source material better than what I've heard the full serial does. Again, thanks for watching. These will be coming out as regularly as possible. I am very excited to go through this series and watch films I previously have and haven't seen and suggest them or shit on them.